Everyone, and welcome to the monthly economic briefing presented by the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I'm External Affairs Assistant Director Rob Knapp, and it's great to have you with us on this Thursday. Something a little different. Thanks for making the shift with us. We're here on a Thursday because the employment report is here on a Thursday. We're going to have a research economist, Sarah Dickerson, along in a moment to talk about that and some other things, the intersection of economics and some of the policies that are in place right now being pursued by the government. Maybe some interesting things to talk about there, as well as a healthy jobs report. So Sarah will be along in a moment to talk about that. She will do a presentation for 15 to 20 minutes. The next 10 minutes after that, we'll take your questions, which she will answer. You can submit those questions anytime you'd like. Go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to do that. If you're a member of the media, please let us know the organization you're with so that we can prioritize your questions. If you are with us by phone, you can still ask a question. Please email it to me, rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. We expect to be doing this for about 30 minutes, maybe a little more sometimes. Stick with us on that, and we'll see where we land. So without further ado, let me introduce the Institute's research economist, Sarah Dickerson, who's going to tell you all about it. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning. Thank you, Rob, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides now. All right. So just want to confirm, can everyone see this? All right.
Yes, I can see it. There we go.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Rob. So I have to admit, we got the numbers in this morning, and I was very pleasantly surprised by a stronger jobs report than I was anticipating. I expected a little more cooling than what we are seeing here. So what do we see happening essentially? So with non-farm payrolls, I mean, this has done exceptionally well, I would say. The number that we received was higher than what we expected. Average hourly earnings as well, that's held pretty steady when we look at month over month. Average weekly hours, again, has held pretty steady. Unemployment, that actually ticked down a bit, so we'll talk about that today as well. And our labor force participation rate. So down a tiny bit. I wouldn't say this is a huge cause for concern. And again, overall, I think this is a pretty strong jobs report. Okay, so let's take a look at our change in total non-farm employment. So as I mentioned, we did see 147,000 jobs were created in June, so we're definitely beating expectations here. Signs again of a strong report. When we look at the unemployment rate, we do see that that ticked downward just a little bit. So we're at 4.1%. And this has to do with what we just discussed. So those stronger than expected job gains. We know that some of those occurred in education and health, some in leisure and hospitality as well. But you may be wondering, what about the federal government, right? Haven't they been shedding a lot of jobs this year? Which is true. So since January, I believe there have been about 69,000 jobs that have been shed by the federal government. Many of these have occurred in the DC metro area. This past month, we haven't seen quite as many challenges in this area as we did the previous month. I would say that's partially due to some agency restructuring pauses, so kind of holding off on some layoffs across a couple of different departments. But we still know that there have been impacts in the VA, EPA, NASA, IRS, USDA, USAID, so across a number of different organizations just within the federal government. So offsetting some of this, we've had gains in state and local government employment. So that's just something to keep in mind, but certainly a lot of jobs lost in the federal government. Now, what about labor force participation rate? I'd still say this is held pretty steady this month. I talked about this a little bit in May. I think it's interesting to kind of look at the prime age workers, so people 25 to 54 years old, both women and men separately, especially because we see that the labor force participation rate is still exceeding pre-COVID levels for women. And we think that's likely because of this rise in flexible work arrangements like remote and hybrid work, but also just the cost of living increase. So it's difficult these days to support a household on one income alone. So we have seen that rise in female labor force participation. Now, in terms of average hourly earnings, we see that at 0.2% in June compared to 0.4% in May. Again, not quite as high as we saw the previous month, but I don't think this is any indication of a collapse by any means. I'd still say that it's holding fairly steady. All right, so there were a couple of topics that I wanted to talk about today that have appeared in the media as of late. And one of them is going to be immigration and deportations. We saw that discussed quite frequently in June in the news, but also tariffs. And this has been in the news for quite some time. So what we see happening here is that our US average effective tariff rate is still quite high by historical standards. So we haven't seen numbers this high since, I want to say, the late 1930s. And this is going to have impacts on a range of different economic indicators. So to start, consumer sentiment, confidence, expectations, our economic policy uncertainty index, our different measures of inflation. Even for firms and businesses, it's going to have an impact on shipping costs. So we'll talk about all of these different economic indicators today. So I wanted to start off with consumer sentiment. So this is really gauging just expectations for inflation and then optimism around personal finances. And we know that this ticked up slightly in June. We also saw it tick up again, or sorry, it ticked up slightly in May and then up again in June. This could be reflecting a belief that the price pressures are potentially easing. Maybe because we were able to reach some trade agreements with a couple of our partners, China, UK, to name a few. But I will say we are still not at the levels of December 2024, so consumers are still expressing some caution here. Now, in terms of consumer confidence, this is more so a measure of the business outlook, underlying labor market conditions, and this actually fell in June, which I found to be interesting because typically, or oftentimes I should say, we see sentiment and confidence moving in the same direction. But here, this could be reflecting that there are some lingering concerns around job availability and the job market, even though I will just reiterate that this was a good jobs report that we were seeing today, and then concerns around general business conditions. Now, in terms of consumer expectations, and this is gauging consumer 6-month outlook, and this is really a component of our consumer confidence. So unsurprisingly, it also fell in June, and we're below that threshold that typically signals a recession risk. So this has been true. There's a cautious outlook across age groups, income levels, political affiliations, and I think that really begs the question, well, does this mean a recession is looming? So I'm going to stick to what I said 2 months ago when I did this briefing in May. I think that a slowdown is more likely than a full-blown recession, but we're still waiting on some additional data before making a more well-informed forecast here. And part of that data is going to be the GDP growth for Q2, which comes out later this month. All right, so let's talk about the real personal consumption expenditures, our seasonally adjusted measure. So this is going to be our monthly inflation adjusted measure of consumer spending. Now we see here that it fell a bit in April and then again in May. That's our most recent data. And this is telling us that consumers are pulling back in goods and services. And again, it's really underscoring some of that consumer caution. Um, I think there's another question that arises here, which is, all right, if spending is down, why isn't the Fed lowering rates at this stage, right? A lot of people have been asking that question. Now, the short answer is that yes, spending is softening. We see that. But inflation has remained somewhat sticky, probably too sticky for comfort if you're talking to the Fed. And that's because they have this 2% inflation target. If we look at headline PCE, which includes that volatile food and energy, it hit 2.3% in May. Core PCE, which is the Fed's preferred measure, hit 2.7%. Now, there is this ongoing disagreement between the Fed, between the president, and other government officials about our inflation target, whether it's unrealistic or not. The Fed has pretty much stated that they want to be patient, they want to be cautious, and get as close to this 2% target as possible. So, given that, I think the late July rate cuts are still unlikely. Um, Even with our stronger jobs report that we're seeing here, I would say that I would say that the September cut is still very much on the table, but the Fed has been pretty invested in this 2% target. So I'd say the late July rate cuts are not as likely. So we've talked about consumers, we've talked about inflation. I thought we could also have a discussion around how tariffs are impacting businesses. So this is a chart from the NY Fed survey, essentially showing us that 75% of firms, local firms that they surveyed, are passing tariff-related costs on to their consumers, at least to some extent. So that's going to be 45% of service firms, 31% of manufacturers that are passing all of their costs onto consumers. So that's going to be those two bars above 100% in the chart. But again, I wanted to talk about what we've been reading in the media as of late. There have been a lot of discussions around what Amazon and Walmart are doing, for example. So Amazon, I will say that about 70% of their products are sourced from China. With Walmart, the latest figures I could find seem to indicate that about 60% of their products are sourced from China. And right now, the US tariff on Chinese goods is around 30%, although the real tariff burden, I would say, is higher than that. So Amazon, Walmart, they are absorbing some of the costs, the tariff-related costs, but because they are importing so many of their goods from China, they're also passing some of those costs on to consumers. So in fact, I think it was the Walmart CFO who recently said, yes, consumers should expect price hikes in June. Now, another trend that's impacting American businesses is going to be the shipping costs from Asia to our east and west coasts. And we saw in June that these shipping costs became quite elevated. And this was ahead of those discussions, those negotiations with China. The good news is we were able to make some progress there. But for a time, you had importers who were scrambling to restore their canceled and delayed sailings that were scheduled for earlier this year, and also to front load shipments ahead of these impending tariff deadlines. Now, this meant demand for containers went up, the supply was strained, and costs were ultimately higher. Now, we see this downward trend now in shipping costs, which is encouraging. I think whether this continues will depend on those ongoing conversations that we have with our East Asian trade partners. Now, what does all of this mean for economic uncertainty? Um, I talked about tariffs today. Another thing that we want to consider when we're discussing uncertainty is the geopolitical tensions right now in the Middle East. So that's going to have impacts on uncertainty as well. So this measure that we're looking at is really a proxy for perceived risk that's associated with some of those upcoming economic policy changes. The good news is that it is down significantly from January, from the beginning of this year, but still pretty elevated by historical standards if we look back over the past 40 years. Now, there's one kind of overarching challenge to this, and I would say that it tends to slow things down. It tends to slow the economy down, whether it's discouraging investments and mergers and acquisitions, slowing hiring, or slowing consumer spending. Across the board, this economic policy uncertainty is going to have kind of broad sweeping impacts on our economy. But let's talk a little bit about the real GDP. We know that the third and final revised estimate for Q1 was released recently, and it was revised downward to this 0.5% annualized decline. So that's reflecting some weaker than expected consumer spending. We talked about that with PCE just a few slides back, and exports as well. So, what does this mean for the recession outlook? I would say we still need to hold off on that Q2 estimate that will be released later this month. For what it's worth, I mean, the Atlanta Fed nowcast seems to think that a rebound is happening and that it could be driven by improvements in net exports. But I do think we need to kind of wait and see what our estimate is when it's released later in July. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, I also wanted to talk about immigration and deportations because, again, this has been in the news quite frequently. So here we're looking at the foreign-born workers as a share of the US workforce. And I wanted to include this graph because it shows that this hit a record high in 2024, a record high of 19%. However, since then, we know that there have been some deportations, and we've seen over 1 million foreign-born workers have left the workforce in this spring alone. I think this is noteworthy in part because during the pandemic, we know that a lot of native-born workers in that 55 plus age range left our workforce, and immigrants filled some of those gaps in our labor force. So I think with deportations, there are potential labor shortages that could emerge in a couple of segments within our labor force, including assisted living communities, childcare, and construction, just to name a few. Now, I'm interested in housing, so I thought it would be fun here to just talk a little bit about that relationship between residential construction and the loss of foreign-born labor. So again, we can focus on what happened this spring between March and May of 2025. We see that the foreign-born workers in our labor force fell about 3%. Housing starts fell about 8%. Why is that the case? I think in part because we know that foreign-born labor makes up a really large share of the construction workforce. So that includes undocumented workers, but about 25 to 30% of our labor force is actually foreign-born labor when we're talking about construction specifically. So I think that's certainly something that needs to be kept in mind, especially with the ongoing housing crisis and the shortage in our housing supply that we're currently facing. I mean, if you do look at this graph and, one of your thoughts is, okay, but there are a lot of factors that could influence housing starts, or do we really have enough data yet to say anything conclusive about the relationship here? I think those would all be very valid points. But what I will say is that this relationship, specifically between deportations and housing starts, has been well documented in the past. So the time to start watching the relationship here that we see unfolding is now in 2025. Okay, so all of this brings me to, again, one of the topics that I think has been discussed kind of widely among economists is our recession risk this year. So I've talked about, changes to our labor force, especially around foreign-born labor, the fact that economic policy uncertainty is remaining elevated. We've seen a drop in consumer confidence and expectations, I still think that the probability of a recession has eased a little bit since earlier this year. And that's for a couple of different reasons. I mean, first, we've been able to pause some of our tariffs, de-escalate some of these trade tensions, and beyond that, the labor market resilience that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. This was a pretty impressive report this month. And so all of these factors can help ease the likelihood of a recession. That said, there's still a lot to watch. Things could certainly change. So we have to look at Q2 GDP growth. Are labor markets going to shift? Labor market conditions going to shift? Are we going to see this continued softening in consumer spending? The Middle East conflict as well, right? So some geopolitical tensions right now. And then lastly, and I think this is a big one, will we be able to reach some trade agreements with our trade partners before these tariff deadlines come to pass? So I'll just reiterate, I think that an economic slowdown is still the most likely scenario, more likely than a full-blown recession, but we will just have to remain watchful as our data rolls in. So with that, I think, Rob, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks for a very comprehensive look at what's going on right now. I think at one point you said you had pretty much the same outlook on things or something in particular that you had a couple of months ago. That is a very hard thing to do in 2025. Things change so quickly. To be able to be right for 2 months, I think, is a pretty good test. So
Well, I'm not going to pat myself on the back quite yet. We'll hold off. But thank you.
we'll we'll check back at the end of the year and see where we are.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks very much. Now it is time to submit your questions to Sarah to answer. Looks like we have room for a few. So you can do that by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're with us by phone, you can send me an email. I'm at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. I just wanted to check back with you to the very beginning where we were talking about, it was kind of an up and down week for predictions of what the number we were going to see today was. And yesterday there was a big jolt when the ADP number came out, and it was a good bit lower than what we're looking at, to the point that there would have been a job loss. Can you shed a little bit of light on the differences between those kinds of sort of pre-release numbers we see and what the government does and why there might be that difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're certainly right to point that out. There can sometimes be a difference between what we're anticipating and then what actually happens. I mean, I will certainly say that I was expecting a little more cooling than we actually saw in terms of jobs added. And yeah, I think that part of that is that there weren't as substantial job losses within the federal government as we might have expected, or as what we saw in the month prior. So I think that's part of what happened here. I think it was also just some job gains that we weren't necessarily expecting in education and health, and then again in leisure and hospitality. So that's, I mean, that's not to say that there weren't any job losses overall in certain sectors. If you look at manufacturing, for example, and temp workers as well, we did see some losses there, but it was kind of offset by gains in other sectors within the economy.
I do know when Gerald Cohen is on, he will occasionally mention temp workers as kind of a bellwether sometimes of what may be coming.
Yeah.
So, but it wasn't quite here if it is coming.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Sometimes we do tend to look at what's happening with temp workers to give us like a sense of the direction that jobs are heading in general. But I would say in this case, yeah, despite some of the losses that we saw there, there were still enough gains in other areas to kind of offset those losses. I don't think that means we should stop looking at temp workers. I think it's still valid to consider this when we're talking about our recession outlook. But yeah, in this case, it didn't automatically equate to a jobs report that that was weaker than expected.
Okay. This one's from Dave Mildenberg at Business North Carolina. He says the GOP wants 18 to 55 able-bodied folks to apply for jobs and or work to qualify for Medicaid. Does labor force participation rate inform that debate at all, or is there no real relation?
So the question is whether the labor force participation rate is impacting.
Mm-hmm. And that may be a little hard to answer since I think that may be more of a political question than an economics question.
It might be, yes.
And
Um,
given the amount of action we've seen on the political front this week in Washington in trying to get a very, very big bill through, then
yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess if the question is really are these numbers informing what we're seeing pop up within the kind of the big beautiful bill, and any cuts we're seeing to Medicaid there? Um, I would say probably not, especially because as we or I looked at where the bill stands this morning right before we went live. And it's still in the House, but I think the Senate passed it fairly quickly. Trump has indicated that he wants to go ahead and sign on the 4th of July. Um, yeah, so I think that there's some determination to get this passed, regardless of the numbers that are popping up in our monthly reports.
and
Now, if you want to know more about how the bill could impact our economy, that I can speak to in more detail, but that's
that
a
is that is exactly my next question, or better yet, the question of a couple of people who have sent questions to us, and that is, how does the passage of the bill, how would that affect your view of the economy?
Sure. So to start, I'm just going to warn everyone this is something we could talk about for an entire hour. So I apologize if this is a condensed summary of my thoughts. So, I mean, there are a lot of different pillars to this particular bill. I'll point out that there have been some independent assessments to try to gauge whether the growth that will come out of this bill actually matches what has been promised in terms of the growth that we should see. So I want to say it's the Congressional Budget Office, Tax Foundation have done their own independent assessments. They expect that there would be far more modest gains coming out of this bill than I think was initially suggested. So, I mean, what are the different dimensions that we'd have to consider? I would say, the tax cuts are pretty broad, and that could be a substantial loss of revenue for the government, could potentially have some impacts on our deficit that are not ideal. So that's one factor to consider. In addition to that, I tend to focus more on housing and immigration, and we know that part of the bill includes increased spending on border control. Um, Again, I see that as a pretty substantial cost that could stand to, yeah, certainly have some negative impacts on our growth. I mean, especially if you consider the labor that would be lost, potential labor shortages if we were to um, see more of our foreign-born workers be removed from this country. So I think those are important to consider. I know that at least one aspect of the bill is that the cuts to Medicaid, cuts to green energy, I want to say. I don't think those are substantial enough to kind of offset the revenue that would be lost by doing substantial tax cuts. Even the child tax credit on top of that, the border enforcement, all of that promises to be fairly expensive. So I think all of these different considerations need to be taken together. But I will say, yeah, in some independent assessments, I think there was a deeper dive into these different pillars of the bill, and essentially what they found is that the growth gains would be actually fairly modest if we take all of these into consideration.
Feels like we need a special edition of the big beautiful briefing uh, of at least an hour, maybe more. Tag team economists through here. It could be a very big deal. We'll see if we can get somebody thinking about that.
Yeah,
We are,
well, and I'd love to have people who have, different viewpoints so we can talk it out. I think that's kind of the beauty of economics is that you can say, well, here, I think this is going to have a negative impact on growth because of X, Y, and Z, but someone could point out, well, what if what if we actually see some benefits because of these other reasons? So I think yeah, that would be that would be a fun discussion.
a lot of room for healthy discussion there.
Yeah,
We are sneaking past 9:30 here, so let me slip a couple more questions in, and you can take quick swings at this.
sure.
Let's see. Any investment or any evidence that the apparently massive investment in AI is affecting job market conditions today?
Oh, that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about AI a lot recently, but more so in terms of what's happening in the stock market, just because we've been seeing, I mean, I don't know if you've checked your investments lately, but I think it's, things are going fairly well in the stock market, better than I would have anticipated. And part of that has been driven by growth in AI and big tech. Um, I will say that if we just focus on this month's jobs report, that a lot of the gains in jobs or the losses in jobs were not so much AI related. But that doesn't mean if we dig a little bit deeper, it could be, let's say that the jobs added in education and health could be related in some way to AI. So I don't know if I have a great answer for that, but I suspect that regardless of how those investments are unfolding right now, they're going to have an impact on job gains or losses in the future.
Okay, last question may connect to that, may not. Well,
Okay.
that'll be your call. So, attendee asked, despite the solid jobs report,
hmm
hiring rates are still really low and disadvantaging job seekers. Can you shed some light on the job market for recent college grads? And that's a story that's been going around a lot lately, that it's not particularly easy time for college grads right now.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that this is kind of a combination of a couple of things, one of which would be AI and big tech, right? Because what we're seeing is that with these advancements in AI, there has been some displacement of those in our workforce already. And a lot of the jobs impacted have been people who are, let's say, in that age range or recent college graduates. So the example I always like to bring up is that my brother manages a team of medical scribes up in Minneapolis, and those are typically going to be recent college graduates who want to eventually go on to PA school, med school, whatever it happens to be. And they're also jobs that are quickly getting replaced by apps. For example, doctors can now download apps onto their phones that perform the same function as the medical scribes they once hired. So I do think that's part of the picture is what's happening in AI, certainly what's happening with big tech, and that potentially replacing some of those recent college grads and the roles that they typically would take on.
Okay. Well, rather than have Sarah do the entire big, beautiful briefing without telling her ahead of time today, we will say farewell for now. Thank you, Sarah, for answering a lot of questions and giving us a lot of insight today. Thank you all to you folks in the audience. We appreciate your questions. As always, you always come through. For our media members out there, if you would like to speak to Sarah or any of our other experts about the topics we've covered here or anything else that you're interested in, please let me know. I'm at rob_knapp at kenan-flagler.unc.edu. For all of you out there, if you haven't paid a visit to our website, you might want to check in. We've got some new things, and we will have some new things coming soon. So important that I wrote it down to remind myself. We're soon going to have a new spotlight. It's focusing on the AI portion of our 2025 Grand Challenge, the Skills Gap. So we hope you will visit us soon to take a look at that. Should be some stuff on that soon. Past that, let me just say thanks for being with us on a Thursday. We appreciate it. So enjoy your Thursday and enjoy your holiday weekend. Thank you.